Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support our channel, please subscribe. The Lost Children of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's quest for a male heir and successor would lead him down a path of execution, heartbreak and financial ruin. The Tudor King is most famously remembered for having 6 wives, and 2 of them would lose their heads inside the Tower of London. But he had many children, including a number of sons who had very tragic stories, and his wives would had a number of failed pregnancies. Giving birth in the 16th century was very dangerous, as there was no pain relief, and one of his wives, Jane Seymour, would succumb to childbed fever, dying of the complications that giving birth caused her. But what is the story of the lost children of King Henry VIII? The best-known children of King Henry VIII are the 3 legitimate children that survived infancy, and would then succeed as kings and queens of England. These are Edward VI, born to his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, Mary I, born to his 1st wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth I, born to his 2nd wife, Anne Boleyn. His 1st wife, Catherine of Aragon, was plagued with the fact she struggled to produce a child for her husband, Henry VIII, who was questing after a son and a male heir. At this time it was hoped for kings that they would have sons who would then succeed them, and the birth of a daughter for these men was often tinged with sadness and worry. But Catherine of Aragon's struggles with childbirth are well documented. On the 31st of January 1510, she gave birth to a daughter who was stillborn and had reached 7 months gestation, and this would be the first tragic loss of Henry VIII's children. But then Catherine fell pregnant again shortly after, and she would give birth to a son who was hoped to have been the great heir to the Tudor throne. Henry, the Duke of Cornwall, was born on the 1st of January 1511, and the king was over the moon. It was everything he had ever wanted, and there were extravagant celebrations regarding the birth of the prince. A huge tournament took place at Westminster, which was said to have been the most lavish of Henry VIII's reign, and this was to celebrate the Duke of Cornwall's birth. However, aged just 52 days, tragedy would strike, as the Duke of Cornwall, Henry, would die inside of Richmond Palace, and the King and Queen were distraught about this. He was then buried inside of Westminster Abbey on the 27th of February 1511. Further heartbreak would come for Catherine and Henry years later, as another son was born prematurely on the 17th of September 1513, and this child, a boy, only lived a few hours. In December of 1514, another son would be stillborn at 8 months. It was clear that Catherine of Aragon was struggling. But then, on the 18th of February 1516, a daughter was born, and this child would outlive infancy. This daughter later became known as Mary, Mary I, or Bloody Mary, and she would succeed to the throne and become the first queen to rule England in her own right and power. Mary was beloved by her mother, but her relationship with her father would become strained following his other marriages, and she would be banned from seeing her mother, who would later be kicked out of the royal apartments. Catherine of Aragon would give birth to another daughter on the 10th of November 1518, but yet again, in the 8th month of pregnancy, this daughter would be born stillborn. With this, King Henry VIII became frustrated, and he was becoming captivated by another woman at court, Anne Boleyn, who would become his 2nd wife. But Anne's problems with having children are also well documented, as this would be her downfall. But her first child with the king would become the greatest Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I. Princess Elizabeth was beloved by her father, but he still hoped for a son. She was born on the 7th of September 1533, and would be the final Tudor monarch. However, a year later, Anne Boleyn had either a stillbirth in the December of 1534 or a false pregnancy. But in 1535 she became pregnant again, but this time miscarried a son, and this was heartbreaking for Anne and her husband. But this would also happen the following year, as on the 29th of January 1536 Anne would miscarry another child which was believed to have been a male in the 4th month of pregnancy. It is believed that this miscarriage may have been brought on by her husband's severe injury on the tilt-yard, in which many believed he could have been killed during a joust. Also around this time she caught a woman sat on the king's knee, and this would be the king's 3rd wife. But Anne Boleyn would of course lose her head inside the Tower of London, but Henry VIII would then marry Jane Seymour, his third wife, on the 30th of May 1536 at the Palace of Whitehall. Jane Seymour, to begin with, would not have a successful first pregnancy, as she fell pregnant very early into the marriage, but on Christmas Day 1536 she would miscarry a child. But then on the 12th of October 1537 she gave birth to the child that Henry VIII had wanted for such a long time. His successor, the future Edward VI, was born. But his life would not be a long one, as he would die at the age of 15, despite succeeding to the throne. This pregnancy also led to Jane Seymour's death, as she would not recover well and succumbed to childbed fever in her quarters inside of Hampton Court Palace. But following Jane's death, Henry VIII was on the lookout for a fourth wife, and his marriage to Anne of Cleves would provide no child or pregnancy, as it believed the marriage was unconsummated. After this farce, Henry VIII then married Catherine Howard in Oatlands Palace on the 28th of July 1540. She was a lot younger than the king, who at this point was large and grotesque. Catherine would after the marriage fall pregnant with the king's child, it's believed, but in 1541 she either miscarried or had a false pregnancy. Catherine Howard would also lose her head inside the Tower of London, as it's believed that she had committed adultery with one of the king's closest friends. Following the disastrous fifth marriage, Henry VIII married his final and sixth wife, Catherine Parr, in Hampton Court on the 12th of July 1543. The pair would be married for 3.5 years until the king died. But Catherine Parr was different to the other wives. She was not as young as the others, and she had been married before, but there would be no pregnancy or issue between the pair, and Catherine would remain married to the king until his death on the 28th of January 1547. But interestingly, she would then, despite being a little older, give birth to a daughter, following her marriage to Thomas Seymour. Henry VIII, it's believed, also had a number of other children, but these were regarded as illegitimate. His most well-known illegitimate child was Henry Fitzroy, who was for a long time even debated to have been his successor. Henry VIII shrouded this son in titles and gifts, and there were talks of Fitzroy becoming the successor. But Fitzroy was born to Bessie Blount, a lady at court, who would die also when he was young, getting to the age of 17. It's believed that Henry's other possible children could have included Thomas Stukely, Richard Edwards, Catherine Carey and Henry Carey, who were the children of Mary Boleyn, who was one of the king's mistresses, despite her sister later marrying the king. Also possible children such as Etheldra Moult and John Perrott were linked to being the king's. But throughout his time on the throne, the king could not produce a son who would then go on to rule the kingdom for decades to come. His heir, Edward VI, would become sick, and he too would die at a young age. But the greatest hope for the Tudor dynasty would have been Elizabeth, the daughter Henry VIII had with Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth would become the greatest Tudor monarch, but also the last, as she did not have any children. But her father would have been proud of the way she ruled the kingdom and dealt with her enemies. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.